Hello, everyone. Welcome to 4th NISS Virtual Industry Career Fair, sponsored by NISS, National Institute of Statistical Science. I am Kevin Lee from Department of Statistics at Western Michigan University, and I will be the moderator for today's career fair. In today's career fair, we'll feature 3 speakers from PPD, Cigna, and Target PharmaSolutions. Our speakers today will describe their perspective on career path and various industry job opportunities. Here we have brief schedule for today's career fair. We will first have Rocky from PPD, and next we'll have Jonathan from Cigna, and lastly we will have Richard from Target PharmaSolutions. Each of our speaker will have 15 minutes for their presentation, and at the end, we will have time for questions from audiences and speakers. Now, I would like to talk a little bit more about the webinar logistics. First, I would like to thank Jim Rosenberg and Glenn Johnson for being our host today. All of our attendees are view-only participants, but we are encouraging you to submit your questions through the Zoom window. And in order to do that, you can click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the Zoom window. Simply type your question for the speaker and then click enter. And I would like to go over a few more remarks for the Zoom settings. When our speaker is sharing her screen, you can minimize that video display of the other speakers by clicking on the dash button that appears on the top of the panel that shows all speakers. Upon the completion of this session, you will receive an invitation via email to evaluate this session. I would like to thank you in advance for providing your feedback. The link to the recording of this session, as well as the slides the speakers used, will be available on the NISS.org website, usually within a day or so. So now I will stop my sharing the screen. And what I would like to stop sharing, and now I would like to introduce our first speaker, Rocky Kilaru. She is a director of statistical science at PPD. In this role, she provides input into study design, analysis, and leads enterprise level business critical initiatives. She also plays an active role in the ASA biopharmaceutical section as an ad hoc member of the executive committee and member of the newly endorsed leadership in practice committee. She has over 18 years of experience in the industry as a senior statistical reviewer and lead statistician on several phase 2 to 3 trials. With that, I will turn my mic over to Rocky.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'll share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for this opportunity to be part of this panel. And thank you to the NISS organizers for putting this exciting event together. So I'm here from PPD, the company I work with, and I'll speak to you a little bit about my company and what we do, and a bit about my own journey as a statistician, and then finally opportunities within PPD for statisticians, analysts, and data scientists. So moving ahead, a bit about my company. We are a leading global contract research organization providing comprehensive integrated drug development, laboratory, and life cycle management services. Our clients and partners include pharmaceutical, biotechnology, medical device, academic, and government organizations. So at PPD, I thought we'd start with our purpose and mission. Our purpose is to improve health, and our mission is to help our customers deliver life-changing therapies, and our strategy is to bend the cost and time curve of drug development and optimizing value. So research, R&D, clinical research especially, is an expensive affair, and we try to do it as efficiently as possible, and that's what we mean by optimizing value. Um, So we have 5 defining principles, and these are critical components in accomplishing our mission. These are principles that guide us and ultimately define us, and these are key principles because it literally drives what we do day to day. You know, we have a strong will to win, we earn our customers' trust, we're game changers, we do the right thing, and finally, we are one PPD. We come together as an organization to meet our purpose and our mission. You can click live at ppd.com careers to get more information on what it is like to be working at PPD. There are some nice sort of personalized, individualized stories as to what everyday, day-to-day life looks like in PPD. So I'd encourage you to go there. A little bit about my journey as a statistician. My background is in biology, so I have a bachelor's and master's in microbiology. And at some point when I was pursuing my degree in microbiology, the goal was to then go into a PhD in molecular biology, but I happened to take some classes in statistics and I was really excited about it. So I decided to get my graduate degree in biostatistics from UNC School of Public Health in Chapel Hill. My first job was that of a statistician at an academic research organization. Perhaps some of you are aware of DCRI, Duke Clinical Research Institute, where I got to lead a large cardiovascular trials, which was quite exciting. And because of the academic nature of the organization, I also got to engage in some really interesting publications work and manuscripts, and got to learn some very interesting statistical techniques. So that was sort of my foundation at DCRI. Towards the end of my time at DCRI, I was involved in other aspects beyond statistics in terms of capacity management, utilization, some financial modeling, and some consulting opportunities as well with the Duke School of Medicine. And so that prompted me to go back to school and get my executive MBA in finance, also from UNC Chapel Hill. And right after I graduated, I decided to come to PPD. And I started in PPD in 2011 as an associate director in biostatistics, where I was involved heavily in operations, so as a study lead on multiple studies, as well as a senior reviewer on cardiovascular outcomes trials. I also sort of supervised quite a few people, and then as director, I led a group of very talented statisticians from our site in Wilmington. And then eventually, about a year ago, I decided to move into statistical science. So statistical science is a very small group of statisticians within PPD, and we are primarily involved in consulting work, in protocol design, atypical problems, adaptive designs, fairly complex statistical problems. And so that's been quite interesting, and I'm quite enjoying myself in this new role. So that was just a little bit of an introduction to where I am and how I got here. And so now, what does it mean to be a biostatistician at PPD? So there are multiple career tracks for biostatisticians, primarily management, operations, and statistical science. So in the management role, you would have supervisory responsibilities, project oversight responsibilities. In the operations space, you would lead multiple projects, so submissions oriented work. And statistical science, as I mentioned, you get to do some consulting work as well. So just to emphasize that the tracks, these 3 tracks are available once you gain sufficient seniority as a statistician. So it splits beyond the senior statistician level. So we expect some level of experience and seniority. The skills that we think would be very helpful to succeed, at least in the initial career stages, is project leadership, organization, and planning. There's several moving parts on a day-to-day in the clinical research industry. So organization and planning and project leadership are critical. As obviously technical skills are very, very important. We do rely very heavily on SAS programming. So that is an important point, which I wanted to emphasize here. Attention to detail, of course, quite intuitive. And I think all of us in the quantitative area are very familiar with this. The ability to continuously learn and adapt, I mean, that is also, I think, really applies to any discipline nowadays, but specifically very useful as a statistician, and compliance with standards. I mean, we are in a regulatory environment and it carries a lot of regulatory rigor. And so compliance with standards is absolutely critical. Currently hiring, yes, we are looking for bright minds and talent to join us. So I have provided these, the contact. Casey Watson is our person from recruitment who can help you, or you can even apply online. PPD is known for having a particularly great training program for new graduates. So definitely wanted to point that out. So that was really my slide on biostatistics at PPD, but I've got a couple more slides here. And this is, I'd actually reached out to my colleague in data analytics. I don't belong to this group, but we've got a very good group in data analytics at PPD. And so this slide is actually from him. So our DA group is embedded within the Global Development Organization. So DA develop and employ analysis across a variety of data sources. So operational metrics, patient data, and other sources of information to monitor ongoing clinical trials. So they do a lot of data surveillance, scientific surveillance, ensure operational integrity, identifying emerging risks. So specifically for this group, programming arm of the DA group, I mean, they work with a variety of clinical trials and operational data. They leverage analysis and visualization tools such as SAS, R, Spotfire. So if this is something of interest, again, please reach out to Casey Watson again with your resume. Data analytics is looking for creative mind, creative problem solvers that can work in a rapidly changing environment, work with complex and varied clinical trial data to get to fit for purpose analysis and tools. So that was a bit about data analytics at PPD. And finally, I want to also speak a little bit about data science at PPD. So this is again, my colleague John Van Hoy. I've included his contact address here in case you want to reach out. He has provided this information to bring forward to this audience. There are three components for data science that he wanted to highlight. One, of course, is the predictive analytics component for operational outcomes. So much of the data science work in PPD has to do with predicting operational outcomes and risks. So some of the examples that he mentioned was clinical trial site recommendation engine, revenue forecast models, taking into account multiple dimensions. The second thing he wanted to highlight was a data dimension problem. And so with this with their operational data, we tend to have a longer array of variables and less prior observations. So that lends itself to innovation and creative thinking that we wanted to highlight. And there's an example there if you want to take a look at it. And of course, the last thing I want to mention is that we are in the process of building a data science center of excellence, which means that this would be built from the ground up and really influence the way we execute a data science strategy. And there's more information clearly on these slides that will be made available, but I wanted to sort of highlight the key elements here. So I think there are quite a lot of opportunities here within PPD. I think these are just sort of the three groups I thought were relevant to mention to this audience. But they, employ a wide variety of skills, and depending on where your leanings are, you could pursue a career in biostatistics, which would of course be, has a lot of regulatory rigor, creative thinking associated, or you could pursue something in data analytics or data science. So I think that was really the last of my slide, and I believe we have a Q&A session later on, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Raki. I mean, it was very helpful information, especially, Yep, I forgot to turn on my videos. Especially you mentioned both not just the biostatistician opportunity at PPD, but you also mentioned that data scientist opportunity and data analyst opportunity also at PPD.
That's right.
Okay, so we were gonna move to our next speaker, Jonathan Lissig. He's a senior data scientist at Cigna, working in the Center of Excellence for Data Science. He develops machine learning models, answering many interesting questions. He has worked in the private sector for 3 years. Previously, he was a senior statistician with the federal government for 12 years, holding positions at the National Agricultural Statistics Service and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. With that, I will turn my mic over to Jonathan.
Hi, thank you, Kevin. Real quickly, I'm going to kind of do similar to what was done before. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on my journey and how I ended up here at Cigna. Then I'm going to go into a little bit of what a data scientist does at Cigna, kind of day to day, and the types of problems, which I think a lot of people in this audience are probably interested in. Then kind of go a little bit to kind of the types of skills that are needed and kind of how they may differ from maybe working in research or something to that degree. And then finally, kind of more general idea of how to find a job, particularly either at Cigna or in general throughout kind of healthcare. So real quickly, could we switch to the next slide? Again, just kind of a general disclaimer. These are, I'll go into kind of my own viewpoints. So these are not kind of necessarily the corporate endorsed viewpoints. So next. So first of all, before I get into the slide, I'm going to give a little bit of a background on myself. So as mentioned by Kevin, I originally started out in government. So that's a bit of a transition. I started working on labor, which is very different than from healthcare to a certain extent. I worked at BLS for a while as a statistician. Then I made my transition to agriculture, which is also a bit different from healthcare. So and also different from labor. So I just kind of switched around a little bit. At the Department of Agriculture, I worked as a research statistician, and there what we're doing is we're solving problems with respect to kind of a lot of sample and survey design type problems, GIS type problems, and also trying to publish. So those were kind of the types of things that happened when I was working at NISS. And then after about 3 years ago, I had an opportunity to work at Cigna. And so I took that opportunity, and that's where I'm here today. Still very happy working at Cigna. It's been a great time. So as you can see, at least through my history, I made lots of transitions through different types of problems, or at least domains of the types of things that we model and build statistical models for. So it's definitely possible to move from an area that is not healthcare into healthcare. It's a pretty steep learning curve because there's healthcare is kind of its own extremely large domain of study by itself. Claims and everything else are fairly complex. So it's definitely possible if you aren't within this domain to make the transition to it. As far as what do data scientists do at Cigna, and I'm sure this is similar to other organizations, the types of problems that we solve and work on are generally fit into kind of a variety of different groups. And these groups are usually put into their own separate set of, at least here at Cigna, they're defined as verticals. Some places they call them silos or whatnot, right? And within these verticals, you have things like sales, and that's where you're trying to kind of sell insurance or other types of Cigna products to companies, right? Since most of them or individuals, depending on where we are. To kind of, that's kind of part of being a company, right? You need to sell that something, and trying to figure out who are going to be your likely next set of sales, right? So we've got those sets of problems. Also, we're a healthcare company, and part of being a healthcare company is that you have certain knobs and levers that you can move around to get kind of improve the overall health of the customers, right? And one of those things is medical management, making sure that people who have particular conditions or are likely to develop particular conditions get the help that they need to improve their overall health, right? So that's the other part, and that fits into medical management. Similarly, for behavioral health, kind of fits in that same group as well. And there's also some finance areas where some data scientists work, particularly with respect to underwriting, things of that nature. Not on that list, we also deal with customers themselves calling into us. So sometimes you deal with service ops and trying to make sure that the customer experience is kind of both fruitful and with respect to getting their problem solved, and also as kind of minimal impact as well. So trying to get people to move to maybe digital when that's possible. So there are all these kind of different spaces where data scientists can work. And within there are lots of different tools that we can use. Particularly for medical management and behavioral health, there are a lot of predictive problems in trying to figure out who is likely to maybe go from pre-diabetic to diabetic, right? So you might want to go ahead and build predictive models for that. And for that, we usually use something like a machine learning type model. So there are definitely lots of machine learning and predictive problems within these set of verticals and the problems within these spaces. Lots of other things. So there's lots of experimental design problems. So you may have a particular type of program to maybe help people, going back to the kind of the pre-diabetic to diabetic, to kind of reduce people from developing diabetes, given that they're in a pre-diabetic state, right? So you may want to evaluate that particular program, and that tends to fall into kind of your typical design of experiments problem. So there are standard kind of problems throughout there. We also send out consumer surveys, so there's still design of sample survey type problems within the space. And then a lot of things are GIS related. So one thing that we deal with is providers, and we build provider networks which have, reasonable pricing, right? So you build provider networks which have kind of lower costs and excellent care, right? So what you want to do is kind of maybe match a individual member or customer to a particular provider. So if I'm looking for a dental provider and I go in, I ask, who should I go to? Then they can identify who I should go to, which is reasonably close to me, right? So that inherently has a GIS problem. And so there's lots of kind of GIS problems in trying to figure out for a particular member, who could they go to, right? And is there a way that we could optimize it so they could see maybe or you can make a recommendation for a particular provider, which is close to them still, with possibly lower costs or higher quality of care. So there's a whole kind of slew of problems that still kind of fit in across these verticals. Can we go to the next slide real quick? So as far as kind of to solve these problems effectively, you need kind of a set of tools. So the first thing that I found out, is really important, particularly coming from a researcher, where most of the work that I do is with, typically with a journal, which is a very different set of communication than it is with something like a kind of an executive, right? So the first problem that I found to be very important, and a particular skill that you need to develop, is being able to effectively communicate with senior management, right? Being able to say, define the problem on their terms. As a statistician, that can be hard, right? It's a fairly difficult problem with respect to communication sometimes, particularly if you're coming from a research background. But I think it's very important to be able to effectively communicate with these stakeholders using their language. Next is another skill that you would need to kind of succeed in this area would be to be able to take that and your ability to communicate with that stakeholder, and then figure out, well, what problem are they actually asking you to solve, right? I found that to be extremely critical skill, particularly in healthcare, right? To first make sure that you're matching a language, because if you move between those verticals, which I mentioned before, the language can be very different, right? So you need to make sure that you are talking about the right thing, and that when you're solving a problem, that you're solving the problem that's actually asked of you, right? You don't have as much free range as you would in maybe your research. So making sure that you can solve their problem and actually give them something that is usable at the end, right? So if you can go ahead and frame that problem that way, I think that's a very valuable tool for you to have if you want to work in healthcare and many other places as well. And then finally, kind of getting back to your technical skill is, can you actually solve that problem, right? So the other problem is, can you meet the needs of that particular domain to solve the problem? And typically what you need is you need a set of reasonable tools. I think most people here have them, right? Skills of predictive flexibility, and maybe jumping from a design of experiment to maybe a machine learning problem to solve whatever problem is asked for you, because you tend to have lots of different problems asked over a career or even within a year, so that you can't really stick within a single discipline. So being able to be flexible and also being able to quickly solve a problem with some form of minimal viable product, which could be a meme, and also being able to create maybe a more complex solution, which takes a little bit more time. And being able to kind of quickly iterate between those and being able to then convey what does this actually mean with respect to the solution back to your stakeholders as well. Go to the next slide. So as far as applying for jobs at Cigna, which we have lots of jobs available. I checked this morning, I checked a few weeks ago, and they're kind of all over the place within the organization. So there are lots of different opportunities if there are particular areas that you're interested in. But in general, for applying for jobs, I'm just going to give you some background, because I know there are a lot of students here. First of all, use your school resources, number one. You've already paid for the schooling, so go, or the school's already supporting you in some sense, so go ahead and give the resources that they're already providing you. So through your school, there's usually some form of people that can help you put together a more general resume. I think that's a very important tool to use if you haven't put together a formal resume before. So go ahead and use those resources because they tend to be freely available to you. Once you have that, then once you find, let's say you go to jobs.cigna.com and you find a really interesting job, then what I would do is look at the keywords that are associated with that job, right? Or for any other job that you apply to, really. There'll usually be a set of mandatory requirements to make sure that you customize your general resume to kind of fit these requirements, put in the keywords that are either sometimes bolded, which kind of gives you a big hint, and to make sure that you meet those. With respect to finding jobs, applying to a blind job may be hard. So just kind of going to the website and just putting in a resume, you may be finding that you're putting in dozens or even more than that. So it can be hard by itself. So one way to kind of speed that up is to go ahead and make connections. Typically JSM has always been a great place to make connections in other types of organizations. If you are involved in AMSTAT or IMS or NISS, go ahead and make the connections that you can, and kind of use those to help you find a job with people who are in healthcare if you're interested in that. Also look for any form of conferences that you may have access to, because it's just creating a personal connection is usually going to be the easiest way for you to get at least your foot in the door for most of the jobs that you will apply to. It also give you kind of an idea of whether or not you want to work for an organization as well, which is also fairly important, which gets me to our next step. You know, when you finally get to the interview stage, one thing that you want to make sure is that, remember, the interviews go both ways. So I think that most people here have the technical skills to go through the interview, meet all those things, but once you're finally at the last step, you need to be able to talk to your colleagues, you need to be able to talk to your future manager and figure out, you know, is this job right for me? I've gone through several interviews and everything has been great. The job seems interesting, but when talking to potentially my future manager or some of the future employees, you get kind of a bit of a miscommunication, or you sometimes have trouble kind of seeing eye to eye, or maybe it seems a little bit apprehensive when you ask questions about kind of the work environment and work culture. And if you get kind of those kind of issues, then maybe that particular job isn't for you. So yeah, remember that you need to feel comfortable there. The way that jobs work these days, you know, you're likely to be there for 1 or 2 years. So make sure that that is the right fit for you. With Cigna, for myself, I found this to be a wonderful corporate culture. So I had none of those issues, but for your interviews, just make sure that it's a good fit for you. Next. Oops, I guess that changed. That was originally white, so sorry about that. So that on the bottom it says jobs.cigna.com. We can probably provide a link within another email to cover that. But yeah, so we have at Cigna, we're still hiring. As I mentioned before, there are lots of jobs across many different verticals. We're looking for people at all levels, from kind of initial data scientists all the way up to kind of management levels. So there are lots of opportunities within the data science spectrum. So feel free to apply. And that's everything. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for all the detailed information, especially like giving a specific example of like machine learning applications or GIS application. I know that we have a few questions asked in the Q&A session, Q&A icon. So we were gonna get back to those questions at the end of the session. And also, if you haven't asked any question, if you have a question, then feel free to ask a question via the Q&A icon below in the Zoom window. Once you click that, you will be able to type your question, and then we will come back to your question after Richard's talk. So our last speaker today is Richard. He is the Senior Director of Data Management and Statistics at Target PharmaSolutions. He is a 2019 Chair of the Biopharmaceutical Section of the ASAA and host of the Biopharmaceutical Section Statistics podcast. Richard is author and editor and contributor to 8 books on statistical topics in clinical trials and clinical research. He also serves as adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Biostatistics at UNC Chapel Hill. With that, I will turn my mic over to Richard.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks to NISS, especially Christy Schwangstein, for the invitation to participate in this career fair. Can you see my slides okay?
Could you like share your screen? I think we cannot see your screen yet.
So many buttons to push. Now can you see it?
Yes, we can see your
All
slide.
right, great. All right, so hello and thanks for the invitation. So today I'm going to talk to you. I think both PPD and Cigna are much larger companies, and they have a pretty clear mission and area with which they work in. And today I'm going to give a little bit of background about myself, talk about Target PharmaSolutions, which I think currently we're approaching 100 individuals. So quite different from PPD and Cigna, but also talk a little bit about the area in which we work in, since it is a little bit new, and talk about specific roles here. So my background, most relevant, I have a master's and PhD in biostatistics from UNC Chapel Hill. This is where I met Rocky many, many years ago. I won't mention how many. And my work career has varied according to a number of different industries. So I had internships within the government as an undergraduate student. I had numerous research assistant roles and consulting opportunities while I was a student at UNC. And I began my work journey, my professional journey at Bristol Myers Squibb, so a very large pharmaceutical company. And after a number of years there, I transitioned to a smaller biotech company, local to Research Triangle Park in North Carolina. So working at the smaller company gave me the opportunity to wear quite a few more hats than working within a larger company where you tend to specialize in one particular area. So there was a greater variety of work. I ended up getting laid off from the smaller company because our phase 3 program in our key, sort of our flagship product failed. And then I ended up at SAS for 7 years, where I wrote software for clinical trials. So quite a bit different from working in the pharmaceutical industry. And now I find myself at Target PharmaSolutions, and really we kind of describe ourselves as a data company, more specifically a real world data company. And I'll talk a little bit about what that is, or sort of motivate that in a little bit. But I have other roles as well. As was mentioned, I was past chair of the biopharmaceutical section of the ASA. I'm associate editor for the DIA journal, Therapeutic Innovation and Regulatory Science. And I'm an adjunct professor of biostatistics at UNC Chapel Hill, where I have the opportunity to interact with students on research projects, as well as teach some classes. So that's a little bit about my background, and I would encourage all of you to have some professional life outside of your work, the opportunities afforded by either teaching classes or being an editor or interacting with the American Statistical Association provides a number of rewarding opportunities that also enhances your work within your company. So, as I mentioned, Target is a real world data company, and to try to motivate what that is, the basic idea is that the cost of clinical trials over the last 20 years has exploded. So I have some numbers here that show, at least through 2000 to 2003, the cost of clinical trials has gone from about $1 billion for one successful drug, accounting for all of the failures along the way, to about $2.6 billion 13 years later. So it's a great expense in conducting clinical research, and we've come a long way in the cost and complexity from what's considered the first clinical trial performed by James Lind, and trying to understand how to get rid of scurvy, and him identifying that citrus would help with that problem. But at this rate, if the cost continues to rise, it will make drugs and development really challenging to even invest in for areas of unmet need, and will stifle innovation in other areas. And for countries that have systems, health systems that pay for medication, it places an extreme price burden on consumers and healthcare systems. So real world data has this idea of real world data and trying to answer a lot of questions about healthcare and pharmaceuticals has really taken off in the last several years. So we don't necessarily need a clinical trial to answer every single question under the sun. So we can make use of a lot of these very large available data resources to answer questions of regulatory importance. And these can come from electronic health records, claims data. So if you submit claims to your insurance company, there are patient registries that exist for specific diseases, oftentimes for rare diseases, that collect data. And the government, the US government, as well as World Health Organizations and the European Medicines Agency, have a number of large pharmacovigilance databases where they collect safety information on drugs as people take them. So we can utilize all of these data to answer these questions about our drugs and about how patients use their therapy. And the benefit of this is that we can see how these therapies are working into the day-to-day world, and not necessarily sort of in the quote-unquote pristine environment of clinical trials. So there are issues with these types of data in terms of quality and structure. There's issues with selection bias that we have to use statistical methods to address. And there's also challenges with not all of the variables we need being within all data sets, for example. So if we're looking at a data set on pharmacy claims, there's not going to be information specific to healthcare outcomes in that. So that's something that we have to consider, and one of the challenges we have to address. And mostly in 2016, the 21st Century Cures Act has really enabled using real world data in a regulatory consideration. And the FDA in 2018 released their framework for the real world evidence program, where they defined real world data and real world evidence, but also gave ideas about how to collect this information and how to use it in regulatory practice. So Target PharmaSolutions is a company that we essentially create these large databases centered around specific diseases. So we try to interact with key opinion leaders, these are generally academics, to develop communities and interact with the FDA and pharmaceutical companies in developing these patient communities to collect data and provide analyses to give insight into these diseases of areas. So our company is approximately 3 to 4 years old, and our largest community is in NASH. We currently have 5,000 patients with up to almost 5 years of follow-up time. And this information is derived from the patient medical records. So using this longitudinal data, we interact with our customers and with the FDA to answer questions of regulatory importance. So the main idea and how we do this is similar to a pharmaceutical company. We operate with a number or interact with a number of clinical sites, and we can send patients to share their medical records with us and collect this data into a database that we then perform analysis on. We also supplement that information with some additional data that we collect along the way. So patient-reported outcomes or surveys that we collect either on a semi-annual or annual basis, as well as collecting biospecimens to potentially enable different types of genetic analyses and using biomarkers. So in this way, we collect all of this information and use this to answer questions of regulatory importance. And there's a number of ways we can apply this data. This can be as early as trying to understand the disease itself and the longitudinal history of the disease, in designing the trial, what kind of patients exist, where do they exist, what kind of information is generally being collected at sites, but also questions about long-term safety and understanding populations that may not be studied as thoroughly in the clinical trial environment. So at Target, we really sort of reside in this unique intersection of industry, the regulatory and academia environments. So we have representation of all of these things in our steering committee meetings, and it's very interesting to see people from FDA sitting down with members from a number of pharmaceutical companies and key opinion leaders to discuss the challenges in trying to understand these diseases and how to analyze them appropriately. We're also at the intersection of observational studies and randomized clinical trials. Certainly we don't do clinical trials ourselves, but we interact with pharmaceutical companies, and in some cases you have the opportunity to create synthetic control arms from observational data that can be used in a clinical trial setting. There's also data from multiple sources. So we talked a little bit about biospecimens and medical records, as well as collecting PROs, but we can also get greater granularity of information by connecting to other publicly available data sources to get greater granularity of information. So there's a host of data and analytical challenges to keep people busy from day to day. And primary responsibilities, particularly for statisticians, we have quarterly reports that we generate within the company to sort of give an overall view of what's happening within each of our study cohorts. And we spend a lot of time in the last two items in publications and confidential queries. So the publications are mainly driven by our academic steering committee and trying to answer questions of scientific interest, particularly about the disease itself or populations of patients that generally aren't studied within clinical trials. And the confidential queries are asked of each of our partners, our pharmaceutical partners, where they may ask specific questions of scientific interest to help guide their development strategies within their own company. And some of the other information that may be of more interest for data scientists, we have these challenges with data linkage and de-identification of data, and trying to connect data across different data sets, as well as developing the infrastructure to calculate metrics to summarize performance characteristics across our number of different communities. So queries can be of a number of different types in terms of the kinds of questions we can get asked, questions related to the natural history of the disease, specific to the biomarkers that are collected, or specific to different drugs. So there's a lot of variety in terms of the questions that were asked. So there's always challenges in terms of the analysis and what we're generating for our customers. So of course, what skills do you need? And just to mention again that we are a 100-person company. We currently have 2.5 statistical programmers and 5 statisticians. There's a small group of individuals that may consider themselves data scientists that are in another group. But on the statistics side, you definitely have to have comfort with observational data and using methods to account for selection bias. Generally, these are propensity score methods, but there are other methods that exist. And certainly categorical data analysis and survival analysis, I've found the most useful across my career, wherever I've been. Certainly, even though we don't do clinical trials, our partners are involved in clinical trials, so having some understanding of the challenges of clinical trials are important. Programming, SAS, I think is king still, but we do have some problems that are more easily solved in R and Python, and some analysts prefer to use those when possible. Certainly data standards are important in analyzing the data as well, and making sure that we can reuse as much stuff as possible for efficiency's sake. And again, I want to emphasize that soft skills are definitely important. So being able to write clear paragraphs, comfort with public speaking and presentation skills, maybe even taking some improvisation courses so that you are you can more easily communicate in a group setting. All of these things will help with your skill set in getting your first job. So I do want to say that there is a lot of opportunity at Target to engage in intellectual and technical muscles. So one of the projects that I had the opportunity to work on was a predictive analytics project where in trying to prevent people from having to get liver biopsies, can we use some of the tests that are derived from simple blood tests to predict the level of fibrosis and cirrhosis within a patient liver. So being able to do that prevents people from having these very painful things performed on them, and basically having a needle stuck into your liver to get samples. There's a lot of issues with that in terms of the sampling of the liver. So ideally it would be best if these didn't need to be performed. So a number of interesting analytical challenges and a great deal of exposure to different facets of the medical product industry. But we also gain greater understanding of patients who may not be well represented in typical clinical development. And I do have some practical advice listed in the slide, but if I can highlight one item while I still have the floor, always make sure that you're updating your CV in real time. You give a presentation, you add it to your CV, you write a paper, you add it to your CV. It's always much easier to take things away for a particular position that you may be applying for, but going back and having to add things, you'll always forget things, and those things really paint a picture about what sort of skills you had or what sort of experience you have. So this is always my biggest recommendation to students. You don't want to get a job and be there 20 years and find yourself needing to look for a job and then having to sort of fill in the last 20 years. That's never very good. So make sure you keep your CV updated in real time. And thanks very much, and look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Richard. Actually, we have many interesting questions. So I mean, we have like about 10 to 15 minutes left, and I'm a little bit worried that maybe I cannot go over every single questions that you guys ask. I'll try my best to maybe combine some of similar questions together so that hopefully we can cover most of your questions. Okay, so the first question is, what advice do you have for someone who is starting his or her career in statistics? Maybe like Richard, you can talk a little bit about like this question.
Sure. My advice would be to try to network where possible. So as a student, definitely try to take advantage of anyone who currently has a career and ask them for career advice, get some sort of mentoring. I'll harp on it again. The American Statistical Association has a number of resources for students, and in particular with the biopharmaceutical section, we have a mentoring program that students and early career professionals can use to get matched up with individuals to get ideas about how to proceed in their career, advice on what classes to take or what opportunities to be made aware of or things to avoid. So definitely trying to put yourself out there through professional groups or some sort of mentoring.
Thank you. Something to add from maybe Rocky and Jonathan?
Yeah, I'm just going to echo those again. So like I mentioned before, it's the developing some form of relationship, kind of can't really do in person as much these days. But going to conferences, doing some form of presentation while you're a student, particularly you've got a little bit of flexibility as a student, so maybe something more towards the career that you're interested in pursuing. And then I'm sure people are asking questions. Ask, if they work at places that seem reasonable to you, talk to them and see if they're hiring. Just talk to as many people as you can. I don't know how mixers are going this year at GSM, but it's pretty cheap, I think, for students for ASA memberships, and I think IMS memberships and all the other various things. If you're in the DC area, I used to be involved with WSS, and they've got a lot of kind of partnerships out there. If you're looking maybe more at the something similar in the DC region. So yeah, just make up as many memberships as you can and kind of connections as you can. Still, if you're looking for a career, it doesn't hurt to send emails to people who are writing papers that seem interesting to you, and figure out, what is a good way to kind of get in with that. And then just events like this, just try to do what you can. Send emails. Emails are cheap. Start up those relationships and see where they take you. Thank you.
So, okay, I want to maybe move on to the next question. So I'm kind of combining the two questions here. So, so there's always a question that if, like, for example, I'm doing an MS in mathematics or I'm doing an MS in statistics, so maybe I don't have much background in biostatistics, and what sort of opportunities available for these students?
So I can go first. I mean, we have had really great talent come into PPD without a degree in biostatistics per se. So again, one of those skills, if you have a degree in, we've had students with math backgrounds or, other quantitative areas, but and it depends on how much experience you have. And let's say you have a math background, but you've worked in a healthcare setting, so that can sort of help you with the experience that you come in with to take on a position with, a lot of responsibilities that other biostatisticians might have in the same position. But I feel it's important that we, as you know, if you have a math background, you don't have a whole lot of healthcare experience, then it's important to come with an open mind, be open to learning, adapting, learning continuously. I mean, one shouldn't have the mindset that, it's my job ends at 5 p.m. We need to be continuous learners right now and going forward. And so as long as that you've got that mindset of being open to learning new skills, understanding the new sort of the research aspects, understanding and willing to take on mentors and learning more about the area, I think that should be fine.
Or Richard, Jonathan, do you have something to add here?
Yeah, and I think, from the three presentations, there's always a variety of problems that exist within a company and new ways in which companies are looking at data. So it isn't necessarily specific to needing a biostatistics degree. Someone may have more experience, say, in doing machine learning type methods, and not really much experience at all in biostatistics. But the problems that we face today are complex enough that no one person's going to know everything. So collaboration with individuals within the company, your mentor, or people outside of the company that you used to go to school with, all of these things are important, and ways to sort of get around things. So I wouldn't necessarily let things limit you.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, that nowadays we work as a group and we work as a team, so that even though you are not an expert in maybe biology, then still that your team will have an expert in the biology, so that you guys can kind of work together as a team. So, okay, so I have a question that any advice for recent graduates without any industry background interested in data science career, especially during current times when going out and meeting, networking with professional is not an option?
Well, I would say the easiest thing to do is just apply, so to kind of echoing a little bit on the prior question. So my boss has a PhD in computer science. Our most recent hire within my I work in the Center of Excellence, where we kind of do a lot of cross-vertical and kind of all kind of interesting problems that aren't traditionally solved. And to meet those needs, we have a lot of kind of non-traditional backgrounds. We hire people that's without necessarily those backgrounds. So if we have an application, and because I see and get to review lots of applications, when I get it in, I'm more interested in, is this person looks like they have are they working in their community, quote unquote, are they working in the data science community? Are they developing things? Are they passionate about learning new things? Because that's going to be really important, because you're going to spend the first 2 weeks trying to learn about how a claim works, right? So being passionate and understanding that, and just, do you have a solid background in solving problems? Can you go back to just kind of the minimal components and just build a problem up from scratch? And do you have relevant experience? And that's really what we're looking for, is people who are able to solve problems in the future, not necessarily do they have the ability to solve the problem right now, day one, right? So I would just apply. If you have no way to engage or communicate people during kind of this whole COVID situation. Beyond that, honestly, I would, if you have projects that you're working on and ways to convey that through your CV, are you working on Kaggle and problems? That's interesting for us that are working kind of the data science thing. If you're solving problems on Kaggle and we can see your research, that's great. And that's a way that you can possibly get leads in. Also, do you work on project on R or Python? Do you create packages for R? You on CRAN? Just if you start having packages or contributing to other types of things, you can also meet people that way. So that's kind of the way I would do it. you consider other venues that where you can build up communications. And also, if you just are looking for a job, apply, right? That's also a fairly cheap endeavor. So best of luck.
Yep. Okay, so I want to move on to the next question. So there was one question about, is a PhD a must working as a biostatistician? Maybe Rocky, could you like answer this question, please?
Yes, no,
Yeah.
no, you don't need a PhD to be a biostatistician. So in my company, we have a lot of people with PhDs and we have a lot of people with masters. And I think, it also depends on where you are in your seniority. So, we've seen people with master's degrees. I myself have a master's degree. And after a while of working through complex problems over years and years, you can move into sort of higher levels and actually work on consulting opportunities. It just takes more time, sometimes because as I think Richard mentioned, the problems are getting more complex. And so a PhD certainly can be helpful and useful, but you can certainly gain a lot of momentum with a master's through experience.
Great, thank you. And we have like more non-technical question here, that how would the day in the life of data scientists be?
So I'll answer that very quickly. So at Cigna, for data scientists, a large, I don't know the exact amount, but a large percent of us work from home. I've been working from home for 3 years now. So for me, I wake up, I go to my wonderful basement here, have my coffee, and answer emails. And then usually what it comes down to is it's a lot of planning, trying to figure out what you have time for whatever projects you're working on. And then trying to make sure that you've got a nice carved out chunk of your schedule that you can actually block off and get actual problem solved, but also make sure that you've set aside time for your meetings with stakeholders. And that's some combination of that is pretty much it. Like today, I came in, answered a couple emails, spent about 3 hours coding some forecasts in R, then dealt with some data stuff for the things I need to do over the next couple of days. And then in this afternoon, I have some meetings with people that are in the project to make, it's kind of a sprint meeting to make sure that everything keeps on moving on and people know where we are. And then later in this week, I'm doing some prep for a big stakeholder meeting. So that's kind of, at least for my day, and an example of a specific day.
Okay, thank you very much. And maybe since we don't have much time left, maybe this will be the last question. I'm sorry for those questions that I could not deliver to our panel, our speakers. So do you guys have any suggestions for getting into statistical consulting? Like, I mean, like maybe.
I mean, I can take a start. I mean, I think, as I mentioned in my journey, so I've sort of, a lot of the initial years, I was leading as a project lead in the sort of the execution space, admissions level work. Just only recently, about 1.5 years ago, I moved into statistical science, and a good part of that is sort of engaging in consulting opportunities. And consulting is, in at least where I am, it requires a lot of other skills, so I did mention a bunch of skills, project leadership, organization, all those skills. But when you go into the consulting environment, you've got to sort of communicate effectively, as in you might not have a statistician in your audience. You might have a very sort of an audience that has a mixture of statisticians and non-statisticians. So how do you communicate sort of complex concepts and solution them appropriately in a manner that people understand and you get buy-in, so you've got to sort of learn that as you go along in your career. It takes, I think, experience and exposure, but that's one thing. And then, of course, as I think it has the messaging from other speakers, the collaboration component is key. So know when you feel that there is there is a level of expertise that you perhaps don't have, engage with your colleagues, other colleagues, and to come up with the best solution for your sponsors or clients that you're working with.
So I think consulting can mean a couple different things. So I think traditionally when we think about consulting, we think about a statistician working with some subject matter person and trying to answer their questions for their particular research. And if you're a student, when I was at UNC Chapel Hill, we had a consulting lab, and a lot of the work that we got was from the nursing school or the dental school or the medical school. And these were students in those departments who were doing research for their own publications or for their own master's or dissertation research. And they needed statisticians to have those skills to answer those problems. So one opportunity is to potentially see within a university where you work what kind of message boards or ways you can make yourself available to your fellow students to provide consulting expertise. You can also try to do this through LinkedIn and certain research groups. The ASA has Statisticians Without Borders that provide free consulting opportunities to groups that don't necessarily have lots of funding. So there's a way of developing your consulting skills and applying them to public health problems that don't necessarily get a lot of attention. And finally, the other way you can think about consulting, you can think about consulting in terms of consulting with other statisticians. So if you have a particular area of expertise, or you eventually find yourself working within a group, you're going to be consulting with your colleagues because no individual is going to have the same set of experiences or the same sort of journey. So how you share your experience with other statisticians so that they can solve problems can also be helpful as well. And ways to do this, you can share ideas. There's always questions coming out through ASA Connect of statisticians reaching out to the larger community. How do I do this? What's the best way to do that? And you can get engaged in those conversations. The ASA also has a consulting section where you can interact and, from a practical standpoint, how do you become a professional consultant in sort of setting up your business? There's ways that they can sort of guide you with that. So I think there's a lot of opportunities available.
Thank you very much. So we already passed like 8 minutes, so I'd like to wrap up our career fair here. I would like to again thank you to all our speakers delivering a very informative information and also helpful discussion during this Q&A. And also I'd like to thank all our attendees joining in this career fair and asking questions. Following this meetup, our attendees will receive an email, a link to survey so that they can provide us the feedback, and your feedbacks are always very helpful to us. So you could reply to us. That will be very good for the NISS organizing the coming up meetings. So finally, I hope all of you guys will participate upcoming NISS events and have a great day and stay safe and healthy. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.